for a special edition of our Fearless Flight Live this week. We wanted to come on just because of the Pegasus crash there. We figured that we'd have a few people out there that might be, I won't say freaked out, but just a little bit hyped up over that. And we'll give you a little bit of information. First thing I want to let you know is we have a blog post that you can go to, and you go to our website, www.fearlessflight.com, and look for the blog there. And I put some answers in there. We're just kind of looking through some notes that I made here. Of course, we want to acknowledge our condolences for the families of those who are injured or may have died in this crash. I saw a variation between 1 and 2 people. That I haven't seen an update, but I haven't checked in the last few hours there. And what appears to have happened is, and this is all in the blog post article that we put up today, is that the airplane landed under at least some sort of adverse weather there. Sounds like it was raining, and it sounds actually like there might have been a thunderstorm in the area, because they were reported to have touched down long and hot. And let's see if I can bring this over here. That's the biggest question, is people were asking, why does that happen? And the reason, actually the biggest question they asked was should I be worried about that whole thing? About pilots making a decision to land in bad weather and all that. And it isn't the bad weather. The weather is one thing, but it's where you land on the runway. So if you got a runway like this, and I went into greater detail on the blog post, and here's my airplane coming down final approach, okay? Let's just say that I'm sure that they probably had 8,000 feet of runway or something like that. And the touchdown zone, TDZ, is in the first 3,000 feet. And actually what we do, we aim to touch down at about 1,500 feet, right in here. But the goal is to touch down here. And as is the case in so many of these overrun accidents like that, is when the pilots land long, the performance that they filed and they went off on, they already knew how much they could weigh to take off. They knew what their estimated landing was going to be. So their dispatchers already figured out this landing problem here.'t if you land somewhere in the last half the runway down here, all bets are off, right? Because you don't meet the criteria for the landing there. And consequently, if you're going too fast, by the time you get to the end of the runway and you can't stop, then you go off the end there. And apparently there was a big embankment at the end of the runway, and the airplane did in fact depart the end of the runway. After skidding for about 200 feet, they said. So they were trying to get it stopped there. And then it went down, and it basically just went down and nose down, and it broke up then because of the whatever velocity they still had there. And this is just little FYI information. When you look at the picture of the airplane, you'll see that it broke in 3 sections. And that's typical, unless the airplane's completely destroyed. The airplanes, if they break up, they'll break up in 3 places: right behind the cockpit, and somewhere behind the wings and the tail section. And the reason that is because that's where the airplane is bolted together. So it's the fuselage, or the nose section, the cockpit section is up there with the flight deck, the middle section of the cabin, and then the aft engine or aft section of the cabin. And where they come together, they've got bolts around 2 frames there, and so again, when you see the pictures, you'll realize now why they break up or tend to break up in that area there. Not a big deal, but it does provide some insight as to why the airplane broke where it did. The things I wanted to remind you real quickly is when you look at this, your mind's telling you, see, there it is. This little voice is in there saying, there it is. I told you so. Flying's not safe. And once again, it's a Boeing. Once again, it's a 737, and it's an 800, not to be confused with the MAX, but anyway. And so you start thinking about it. It starts pulling up all those things to support your belief and your story that flying is inherently dangerous. And remember, you've heard me say this before, but the part of the brain that triggers your worry and your anxiety is like a smoke detector. And what does a smoke detector do? It lets you know if there's smoke somewhere in the house. And but it doesn't care whether it's burnt toast or whether it's a grease fire on the top of your stove. It alerts you with the same notice and in that. And this part up here is designed to kind of like filter that if we can. But some of us have survival instincts or fight or flight responses that are basically a little bit running amok when we get things that are not a threat. But again, like a smoke detector, your amygdala, the part of the brain that's telling you that you need to do something, it doesn't care whether it's a real or an imagined threat. So that's the thing. So we can't deny the reality of the fact that this airplane, this is another incident or accident there. Sounds like there was some loss of life there. Very, very tragic. But those things happen. And they get widely reported in the news. I mean, years ago, it would barely make the news if an airliner crashed somewhere else in the world other than the U.S. But now it's because we're shrinking as a planet. It's newsworthy everywhere now, and particularly because of the airplanes that they're flying. In this case, another Boeing. So let me look through here just real quickly here about some of the questions. Is the Boeing 737-800 safe to fly in? As far as we know, it is. And again, without judging, what happened, because I don't have enough information here, but just based on the information that it was landing long and hot. Hot is an expression for faster than what the target speed was for landing. Looks like it's going to come around to some element of pilot judgment involved in that, and we'll have to find out what that is. Somebody wanted to know if it had anything to do with the cracks that were found in that section. Remember that the pickle fork that we talked about a few weeks ago? I have no reason to believe that that'll be part of it. But again, we don't know until we get some preliminary reports out of there. High winds and heavy rain. That's I've responded to that. This was a Turkish airline. It was Pegasus airline, I believe, 2193, something like that. And they had another crash not too long ago. And so, immediately that flags that particular airline. And the thing I could say is, should I fly in these airlines? Should I fly in any airlines like that? It is a low cost entrant in the European market there, the Pegasus Airlines apparently. So stick with us, and we'll look through the data and see, whether this appears to be in a category that maybe it shouldn't be your first choice at least. And your odds of flying in a tier 1 airplane and dying in that are 1 in 33.2 million to 1. So that's not hardly even worth mentioning. And there's 2 other tiers in there. That would be United States domestic carriers, European carriers, Chinese carriers, Australia and New Zealand. And the tier 2 and tier 3, your odds of dying in a plane crash there are still better than what they were in the United States 15 years ago. So that just goes to show you where aviation safety is going. This airline probably operates according to the rules and standards of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which is a division of the United Nations. And so I have no reason to believe that they don't follow standard procedures and training. And again, we can talk a little bit more about some of the things here. Why do accidents happen? One of my favorite sayings is Stephen Covey. He had a quote: "Nothing breeds success or nothing breeds failure like success." And what he meant by that was the longer you go and the smoother your operation and your decisions go, the more susceptible you are to missing something. And that is really one of the challenges in modern aviation. That's what I spent the last 15 years of my career working on, teaching pilots how to prevent complacency, how to build a better team with their crew, not only the other pilot, but the flight attendants in back, so that we could be backup for each other. And if this turns out to be an error on perhaps the captain or whoever was flying the airplane, the other pilot is just as culpable because he or she had an obligation to say something as well. And that's what we taught our pilots. The pilots that I taught had to go through my class when they were newly hired at the airline. And no matter what kind of experience they had or where they'd been, one of the things I would say at the end of the 8-hour block that I would teach them that first day was, I want you to when you leave my class here, I want you to think about this one question. Was there ever a time that you sat there in either seat in your previous jobs as a pilot where you questioned what the other pilot was doing, but for whatever reason you didn't ask, you chose not to ask, whether you were worried about him reprimanding you or getting upset, or you didn't want him to think that you were uppity, or you didn't want him to, you didn't want to ruin the good atmosphere in the flight deck at that time. Whatever it was, that's the thing that I wanted them to work on. I wanted them to make sure, because the pilot is the most important backup system on the airplane.
So Captain Ron, can I just jump in here? Because
I think you just did.
Yeah, because there's questions, and you didn't give me an easy in here. First of all, thank you so much for posting your questions here. And I believe you've already answered a couple of them. One of them from Susan is, do all countries train pilots the same? And I believe you just said earlier that there is a universal organization that is overseeing the training of pilots, or? Yeah,
so just let me jump in here just real quick. So if I'm flying a Boeing 737-800 and you're flying a Boeing 737-800 in your country or your company and somebody else's, Boeing provides the guidance for the training to each airline. And then as an airline, I get to choose exactly how I'm going to deliver that training. And then the FAA, in the case of the United States, they come in and they have to approve that training program and certify it. Okay, so the same process goes on for Pegasus. A lot of new start foreign airlines often subcontract their training to Boeing aircraft, at least their initial cadre of pilots. And I apologize, I don't know how long Pegasus has been flying, but
about 20 years. 20 years.
Okay. So hardly an upstart there, and so they probably had their more than likely had their own training department. But if Susan and I wanted to start a new airline right now, and we're going to buy 737-800s on it, we'd probably go to Boeing first and say, can you help us set up our training program? And can you help us with the first, 20 crews or something like that we're going to put through? So the training is standardized, and it definitely has to meet the criteria that Boeing laid out to develop competency. And then it's not just your initial training in an airplane. I had to go through recurrent training every year. I have to go through the simulator. Now most airlines are on a program where they send their crews back through training once every 9 months. Which is even more than it was before there. So to answer your question, yeah, and what Dieter was touching on was the International Civil Aviation Organization. They standardize the air traffic control procedures. They standardize a lot of the search and rescue things that every airline around the world, so that for matter of fact, they were the ones that say English is going to be the standard language for international traffic. So every controlling agency on the planet who participates in ICAO has to use English to talk to the pilots there. So, okay.
And I just want to throw this in because I looked this up a little earlier. Pegasus Airlines has, according to the European overseeing body, a good track record. They don't have any bad standings, and they're allowed to fly there. So, but I want to move on to, was there, I mean, you already touched on that. Was there a way to prevent this? And the most important factor of speculation at this point, barring any kind of mechanical issue is human factors, probably, right?
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. But again, based on initial reports, it sounds like the weather and even worse to compound their problem, not only landing long, but they had a tailwind behind them. So we normally land into the wind, you know, because when if I'm flying my final approach speed at 150 miles an hour, and we'll just say we had a 50-mile-an-hour wind coming straight down the runway, I'm going to take my 150 miles an hour going towards the runway, and I subtract the 50 miles an hour when it comes to my ground speed in the air mass I'm moving. So now I'm only landing at 100 miles an hour over the ground. And so that lets me land at a very slow airspeed. Turn that around. And we don't do this, we have restrictions against this, but for the sake of demonstration, now let's say I'm going towards the runway at 150 miles an hour, and the wind is behind my back at 50 miles an hour. Now I have to add that. Now I'm touching down at 200 miles an hour or 100 miles an hour different than if I turned around and landed the other way. So that it sounds like that's what they were up against. And the criteria that we use for landing, and this is in the blog post article that I wrote today, we have limitations on crosswind, the crosswind component. Okay. And so we get live reported actual live observations of the weather, the winds, and the velocity and the direction. So we can then compute what the crosswind component is. And most airplanes have a 25 knot or about 30 mile an hour crosswind limitation. So if the winds is greater than that, then we can't land there, or at least land on that runway. We have to find out if they have a runway that's more aligned with into the direction that the wind's blowing. So that's one thing. And we have a limitation on how much tailwind. The standard Boeing limitation is 10 knots. So about 12 miles an hour. We can't land if the wind behind us is more than 12 miles an hour, because it then violates all of our takeoff or all of our landing data. And so the numbers are no good and we can't do it. So it sounds like they may have been involved in two of those, landing with a tailwind that might have been excessive and landing too far down the runway.
So one more question. Why could he not have turned off the runway? Is that a question of being too fast, or
yeah, he was too fast?
Yeah,
yeah,
so the rain and
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at the pictures there, and he when he got to the end of the runway, he was going too fast to turn. That would have probably been a worse choice, depending, because it might have collapsed the gear and caused the airplane to roll. So we don't know. Yeah. And
I'm pretty sure that that particular airport, which is super hard to pronounce, so I won't even try, that particular airport is going to look at their, that runway number 6, because in 2019, another Pegasus airline skidded off the runway, but in a little bit of a different vector than the plane. Yes.
Do you have a diagram with the length on it there, Dieter?
You know what? Just keep talking. I will pull it up.
And you remember what I showed you up here? So I didn't see the overall layout of the airport, but that may turn out to be a factor if it's a shorter runway than normal. And if it's certainly you wouldn't expect it to be shorter than about 6,000 feet. But that may have been a factor. And again, the important thing is that no matter
what, the runway is longer. It's I think. Hold on, I actually put that in the post, so I can tell you exactly how long that.
Okay.
It is. If you help me put it into, I don't know if I converted it or not. So it was runway number 6, and it is 3,000 meters. So that's 9,000 feet.
Yeah, so that's almost 10,000 feet.
Yeah. And it's 45 meters wide.
So that's about 150. That's a standard nice runway for a big airport like that. And I'm looking right at the slide, or at the picture of the runway there. And when whoever asked why didn't they turn off at the end, you'll see that at the end it's a 90-degree turn, so they couldn't have done it. Had they had maybe a high speed, if they but the high speed, they would have had to land further back down the runway. I think we're going to find out that the problem was they landed too far down the runway with too much wind behind them. But regardless, one of the things that the accident investigation will disclose, it will say what happened and what do we need to look at. That's why aviation safety, despite the fact that incidents and accidents like this make the worldwide press, and they instantly and they trigger everybody's anxiety, it's because it is so rare. Even though we've had 3 in our close-in memory or recent memory, but it's not, it doesn't happen that often. That's why it's so rare. And again, you've heard me say you can't solve an inner problem with an outer solution. All right, unless that was part of the actual accident and there was something wrong with the runway. But your anxiety, your role as a person who is triggered by aviation, your role is to work on your stories that you tell you. And thanks for tuning in, because that's the best place to start, is to reaffirm what you know. And again, go over to the blog post, because you got a lot of good stuff in that article about considerations that you want to take under consideration to keep this from either aggravating your existing fear or triggering something that you shouldn't be worried about there. So